Welcome, everybody, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, Veterinary Practice Succession through Cooperative Ownership. My name is Pedro Maturana. I'm a Cooperative Development Specialist with the California Center for Cooperative Development, or CCCD. I'll be co-facilitating today's webinar with Kim Kuntz, who's also the Executive Director at CCCD. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly review today's agenda. Kim will begin with a short introduction to cooperative ownership and veterinary practice succession. And then we'll hear from our panelists who will share their experiences from the perspectives of veterinary practice owners and cooperative developer and an attorney. We'll conclude with a 10 to 15-minute Q&A where you'll have an opportunity to ask questions for our panelists. And to help us stay on schedule, please post your questions in the chat as they come to mind. We may answer a few questions during the presentations if they fit naturally into the discussion, but we'll save most of the Q&A for the end. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce today's panelists. We're very fortunate to be joined today by an outstanding panel of speakers, Dr. John Daly and Dr. Anne Vetter are veterinarians with Cooperative Veterinary Care in Wisconsin who successfully transitioned their practice to cooperative ownership. Kristin Forde from the UW Center for Cooperatives, who has extensive experience helping businesses convert to cooperative ownership, and Paula Eisner, who's an attorney with the Tuttle Law Group, who specializes in cooperative law and business conversions. Thank you all for being here again. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Kim Kuntz. Kim will start by looking at the changes taking place across the veterinary profession, the growing trend towards corporate ownership, and why cooperative ownership has emerged as a compelling option for practice succession. Kim?
Hi, I just want to kind of cover some of the overview of what's happening as a reminder probably for most of us, but there's been really a transformation of professional services as we shift. There's been a dramatic shift actually to private equity and large corporate ownership, and that is restructuring work in all kinds of professional professions, medicine, dentistry, veterinary, accounting, and now law is getting added more and more into that group. So these private equity and large corporate firms are fundamentally transforming professional services by shifting them from independent partner-led firms to highly scalable data-driven businesses. And this consolidation is really restructuring work into corporate models that are really characterized by standardized operations and increased administrative oversight. And this has led to key shifts in the workplace landscape in this arena for all of these professional professions. Loss of clinical autonomy, so often operating as management services organizations. They separate business operations from the licensed practice. And this can pressure professionals to prioritize revenue, see higher patient or client volumes, or follow kind of rigid corporate protocols that could conflict with individual judgment. And then part of this is streamlining operations and having a focus on profitability and data tracking. So they create efficiencies through these standardized practices, through standardizing IT, administrative practices, and shift the professional's day-to-day focus toward data tracking and profitability. And then there's also a lot more capital and access to resources. So corporate ownership provides funding for better software, facilities, and broader support staff through the consolidation. And this can also mean a shift toward utilizing less expensive, unlicensed or mid-level staff to and other measures to cut costs. So you want to go. So how does that look, particularly in the veterinary industry? Can you go to the next slide? So private equity firms and consolidated corporations control right now about 50% of market share in veterinary services. So about 30% of the general veterinary clinics and 75% of specialty clinics are owned in this fashion. Corporations are really large conglomerates. In fact, one of the largest owners is Mars. I mean, this is the candy company. So this change has been really, really rapid. A decade ago, there were only at 8% that were owned by these large corporations. And then we've also seen a closure of clinics as we consolidate. So it's this consolidation of services into fewer large clinics to improve the bottom line. It can also leave smaller communities without local services. For vets, this means reduced autonomy and alternative pathways to ownership and succession. So veterinarians report a pressure to meet quotas, reduced ability to set ethical or community-driven standards, but they are able to, like I said, acquire larger, more up-to-date equipment. For consumers, definitely increased costs and fewer choices. Vet bills have increased disproportionately to the national inflation, increasing about 44% the cost for veterinary care since 2019. And for local economies, this is also really affecting. If you find an erosion of local wealth, rather than keeping profits local, they are extracted to corporate and private equity investors. Yeah, just briefly also to set the landscape here and the focus is really a cooperative is fundamentally a business that is equally owned by members. So a cooperative is a member-owned business that is democratically controlled on the basis of membership, not ownership share. That's the main thing that distinguishes owning a share in a cooperative from owning a share in a large corporation. It is democratically controlled. Each member gets one vote, which is also consistent with it not being tied to the ownership share. Profits are shared according to the contributions of members. They pretty much operate in cost in order to share profits with members. And the profits are shared according to the contribution of members rather than ownership shares. And I'll describe this in a minute, but it can be described in the bylaws and it's created by the members. How are they used in vet medicine? They're used primarily in 3 different ways, where single or multiple practices cooperatively are cooperatively owned by the vets, vet techs, and other workers. So this might be a single or multiple vet clinics that cooperatively own them. They generate profits. People are generally paid a wage, and those wages can vary. They can be set up in whatever way the membership decides. And then the profits are established by the co-op, how they're distributed. They might be partly influenced by position. They might be on wages earned, hours worked, those kinds of things. Those are decided by the co-op and incorporated into the bylaws. Another way that co-ops can be used is that multiple clinics can share access and ownership of large equipment and or services. And this could be an alternative to depending on larger corporations and so forth to make these expensive investments. So these multiple practices can share access and ownership for those large equipment and services. And then the third way is to join or start a purchasing co-op. And you already have these. So, purchasing in bulk, sharing things, and making investments, even education can be done through the purchasing co-op, which is owned by all of the veterinary members. So there are 2 examples. Many people already probably purchase from the veterinary cooperative, TVC. Sometimes people don't even realize that it's a co-op, but that is a cooperative that is widely used in the industry. And then there's one called EPIC that is really focuses on equine vet practices, and this does similar things to TVC. So also just to say, any of these cooperative uses could be combined or independent of one another.
Thank you, Kim. We'll now begin with the first part of our panel discussion. This webinar is focused on the worker-owner model. Our focus today will be on the experiences of Dr. Anne Vetter and Dr. John Daly, who will share their story of their veterinary practice in Wisconsin and what led to the decision to become a cooperative as a retirement and succession strategy. With guidance from the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, in January 2023, they incorporated as Cooperative Veterinary Care, CVC. John and Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
This is my life partner, Anne, who also ended up becoming my veterinary partner in the last few years of our career as we transitioned our small practices in a rural community to employee ownership. I'm going to give a very quick summary, and then Kristin is going to take over and kind of go through the step-by-step details of what the process actually looked like. In 2019, we went to a large conference that had a talk that talked about succession planning, and we were in our early to mid 50s, and we started realizing, oh geez, the profession has changed. You don't just sell to your younger associates anymore. The most practice succession is going to corporate ownership, and that didn't feel right to us. So over the following couple years, I started thinking more and more about other alternatives, and eventually came across the idea of cooperative ownership. And so in end of 2021, 2022, I reached out to the UW Center for Cooperatives, which was very near to us in Wisconsin, and we started working with Kristin and one of her associates to help walk us through the process, holding our hand along the way. And in January 2023, we became a new entity that was called Cooperative Veterinary Care. It's been very successful, and we've been really happy with the outcome. You can go to the next slide. Early on in the process, even before I connected with Kristin, I found this resource online that I thought was helpful to just kind of walk me through the process. You can go to the next slide. And it basically just had a bunch of questions for us as owners of these small businesses to try to decide, is this something that made sense for us? And then something we could then share with the co-op developers to help them walk us through the process. The next slide kind of gives you a better sense of how much time and money this might take. It's going to vary from situation to situation. We were fortunate in that we were able to do this relatively quickly. And we had some financial assistance through a grant that happened to be available to us at the time through our state organization. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kristin now to kind of start walking through the process, and we'll add more details from our experience along the way.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm Kristin Forde, and I started as a cooperative developer at the exact same time that John, Ann, and Mark began exploring this conversion. So I was lucky because it was a perfect opportunity for me to both learn the process and share my experiences as a worker owner. This is the actual timeline, and we're going to talk about each of these milestones in a little more detail. But it took about exactly 1 year for the clinics to convert to a cooperative. But there were phases in that year that we're going to talk about now. Next slide, please. So as John mentioned, the first thing that we suggested to them when they came to us was that they pursue a cooperative development grant that Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which is the entity that funnels state dollars earmarked for economic development. They have a cooperative development grant that paid for professional fees for things like attorneys and consultants. And we always start with a feasibility study. And so that was probably the most costly piece of this early stage. And luckily, they were awarded this grant, and those dollars could be applied to the feasibility study. Next slide. And so the feasibility study is a key part of this process. We worked with ICA Group, which is an organization that focuses on employee ownership. There are other groups who do this work as well. But we teamed up with ICA Group, and they dug deep into organization, their businesses documents, financial documents, other policies, and looking at state statutes. They wanted to make sure that the future cooperative had the capacity to take on debt that would be required to purchase the business from the owners. And John and Anne, could you actually describe a little bit of that process, what that was like with ICA Group?
Yeah, so we basically had a lot of back and forth conversations. They let us know what they needed from us, and it would be similar to what you might be providing to any other group when you're thinking about selling your practice. So they asked us for 3 years of basic financial statements, profit and loss, and equity statements, and then they asked us for lists of the equipment, the inventory, what we typically kept on hand. They also talked about what we might be expecting for a sale price after transition, and then looking at they did an independent evaluation to really kind of determine what they felt our practice would be worth to an outside buyer and what that asking price might be. And then they went through and did their calculations on whether or not this new entity, the cooperative, could really afford the payments to take over that kind of a business. If they had a business loan, what would that look like? If there was seller financing, how might that be the same or different? And really, is this boat going to float, essentially?
Right. Great. Thank you. And then they also took a look at, asked a lot of questions about staffing and, how many people had been there for how long? Was there a culture of participation? Was this going to be a transition that their employees could kind of carry forward? Next slide, please. So the financial piece was the trickiest of all because the valuation came back showing that the business was worth essentially more than what the cooperative would be able to pay back in a traditional loan. And so the owners, John, Anne, and their former business owner, Mark, all decided because they were committed to this that they were going to finance the sale completely. So that meant that at the time of transition, the cooperative would have a promissory note with the former owners, and they would pay back over the course of 10 years the selling amount or the price of the business. So this was a big deal. This is a relatively common practice. Many conversions end up being seller financed because the sellers are committed to keeping the business in the community. It's a part of their legacy. And in order to, they're not needing that cash up front. However, there are many businesses that also have a financial stack so that sellers can get some cash up front because the business or the cooperative takes out a loan, and there is also some seller financing. So this way, sellers can get part of the price upfront in cash, and then the remaining can be paid out over time. Um, there were also some legal considerations for cooperative veterinary care. This was easy. We learned that there were not any state regulations that would limit ownership in such a way that there could be collective ownership was allowed under state regulations for veterinarians. I am actually going to pass this over to Paola to talk about when in this feasibility stage, what kinds of legal questions and considerations need to be taken into account.
Thanks, Kristin. Hi, everybody. My name is Paola Eisner. I'm a co-op attorney with Total Law Group based in San Francisco. And I'm working on a conversion of a vet clinic right now. I'm going to be talking mostly about California considerations, but these can be similar in different states. So just check what applies to you. Next slide, please. So the main reason that professional corporations can be subject to this type of regulation is, there's public concern for consumer protection, that the profit-seeking behavior that Kim was talking about that might be driven by private equity consolidations or other actors looking to make more money, that this can affect the type of care that consumers are receiving at a vet clinic, at a doctor's office, at a law firm. If the primary consideration is profit instead of professional judgment, then the consumers may not receive the type of care that they need. The result of these regulations is that, if you're looking to do a conversion, then you may need to look at what's required and what's possible. But at the end of the day, for now, private equity has found plenty of workarounds to these requirements, and they continue, extracting and making profit. So your co-op conversion will be able to find a workaround as well. I'm going to go into more details in the next slide. Okay, so in California, the Moscone-Knox Professional Corporation Act says that for professional corporations incorporated under this act, the professional corporations cannot be owned by non-licensees. So in a veterinary clinic, vets and vet techs are likely licensed, and other staff members might not be licensed. This requirement applies to any profession that must operate as a professional corporation or any group that decides to operate as a professional corporation. In this case, in California, veterinary clinics are not required to be owned by professional corporations. So the limitations in this act apply more to other professions in California than vets. Vet clinics do need to look at relevant laws related to vet practice in California, including California Assembly Bill 1535 and the Veterinary Medical Practice Act. Next. So here's what we're looking at, right? Your goal in a co-op conversion is to bring all of the members into ownership and governance of the vet clinic. We're aiming for a non-hierarchical flat structure where everyone participates in decision making. One central co-op principle is that each member has one vote, and that everybody also has access to membership. On the other hand, these protections, consumer protections for professional corporations, want to make sure that only licensees are making practice decisions and professional judgment and exercising professional judgment. Laws that do apply to vet clinics bar non-licensees from influencing or directing the professional judgment of licensees. And in other professions in California, only licensees can be shareholders. So that can really affect, your options when you're structuring your future cooperative. And it also affects governance and decision making, who can participate in what decisions. Of course, we all, want to make sure that the licensees are practicing in the way that they see fit and exercising their own professional judgment. Next. So workarounds. In this case, in California, for veterinary clinics in particular, vet clinics can be owned by cooperatives. They are not required to operate as professional corporations. And non-licensees can be members of those cooperatives as long as the non-licensees are not influencing licensee professional judgment. So what that will look like in your co-op conversion is that you'll likely have different member classes for licensees and non-licensees, and your governance documents, like your bylaws or your articles of incorporation, will restrict the decision-making authority of non-licensees to make sure that only licensees are making certain professional judgment decisions. So, your legal team, your advisors should make sure that your bylaws define what professional judgment is and list the kind of practice decisions that can only be made by licensees. So again, typically in a cooperative, all of the members are making decisions together. In this case, because of legal requirements and because of our general, we all want to make sure that it's the vets and the vet techs that are making certain decisions. Your group should agree ahead of time, both on the definition of what a professional judgment is and what must be included in that list, and also what else you want to include in that list of decisions that should be reserved for the licensees. For other professions in California that are required to operate as a professional corporation, that are restricted so that only licensees can own that professional corporation, there are still options. So as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, a lot of times private equity will use a management services organization. This is also an option if you're doing a co-op conversion and you must use a professional corporation. You can separate out the professional corporation that's only owned by licensees and a management services organization that might be a cooperative or that might operate on a cooperative basis. And that management services organization can own the property and lease it to the professional corporation, or could charge the professional corporation for administration and for other roles. And this is a different way that you can separate out that those professional judgment decisions and that part of the practice from the day-to-day operations of a vet clinic and the business of running a vet clinic. And definitely make sure to look for the requirements in your state, because it varies a lot state to state. And we may see shifts on what's required in California as the legislature, reacts to what's happening in the private equity space.
Okay, so we will now transition back to Kristin, who will talk about what happened once it became clear that the cooperative conversion was the right path forward. And Kristin, John, and Anne will walk us through the next steps in their journey. Kristin?
Thank you. Yeah, so once it was determined that there were not any legal barriers and that the owners were going to finance the sale, We held a meeting where we presented this information to all of the staff. We showed, ICA Group did a presentation on the feasibility report. And we talked to the staff about what was going to happen, that John, Ann, and Mark were going to sell the practice, these 2 clinics, to their employees in the form of a worker cooperative. And we talked to them about what that meant for them as employees, that they would have the opportunity and that there would be some privileges that came along with membership, such as determining what to do with profit and to allocate, to distribute that profit among members, but that there would also be some responsibilities that members would carry. And we invited all staff who were interested to participate in a process that would take place over the next few months of designing their new governance system. There were about 18 to 20 employees at the time, and 13 or 14, I'm forgetting the exact number, but they signed up to be on the steering committee. And from there, you can move to the next slide. From there, my colleague and I, Courtney Berner, who is the executive director of the center, we planned and facilitated an 8-week process where these 13 members, we met weekly. We alternated between in-person meetings and virtual meetings. And we modeled the democratic decision-making process and practiced, but in that practice, they made key decisions that would be part of their governing documents when they converted. And so some of those decisions included things like what their board composition would be. And through the process, at the end of their process, they determined that one of the member responsibilities would be to serve on the board, and that every member would serve on the board for at least 1 year, and that they would assess that at the end of their first year. They also made decisions about what member criteria would be. So what did they need to see from future employees before they were invited to become a member of the cooperative? At the end of that process, everybody learned a ton about different ways of facilitating conversation and deliberating and coming to agreement on these really significant decisions and choices that they were making about their governance structure. John and Anne, do you want to add anything about that initial process where we were kind of deciding that you had every position of the clinic sat around the table together and made these decisions? What was that like for you as former owners, or at the time you were still owners and you were participating?
Yeah, I would say that was probably, it is why I always tell people when they're considering this, first thing you should do is reach out to somebody like a cooperative center to help walk you through that process, because it is so different from what we were used to doing as just private owners. You made the decisions, you might have gotten input from your employees or key employees, but there was not that collaborative decision-making process that we were used to, that we were used to working through. So it was really helpful going through that process.
Yeah, I think exactly as Kristin said, everybody learned a ton, including us. Some of the things that we thought the group might decide initially were very different from what they decided in the end. But it was invigorating to work through the process. It was enlightening, and it was inspiring.
Really fun. It was so fun to see everybody share ideas that you didn't realize how much was inside everyone's heads, and were helpful, really helpful.
And probably the only co-op in the world that votes by meowing or woofing. I don't know. It was a lot of fun. And it took, like I said, about 8 weeks to draft these documents. And then we took care of the technical pieces with our attorneys and, with input from accountants. And on January 1st, they were incorporated as a cooperative. Next slide, please. So in that first year, especially, I worked very closely with the cooperative. And in fact, you can just go right on to the next slide. So what that looked like, we agreed to some post-conversion support. And so I had weekly office hours with the president of the cooperative, who was a veterinarian, but not a former owner. There was a vet tech who was the future president, or the vice president in more traditional terms. And I neglected to mention that every eligible employee opted to become a member. Now, in the first couple of years, there were changes that have taken place. There are changes that have taken place, but there was an enormous amount of buy-in from the beginning. And so I met weekly with the president to help them think about agendas and what issues were coming up and how to plan and facilitate meetings. And I also met with leadership we itemized the work that John, Anne, and Mark had been doing as owners to try to determine where that work would land in the cooperative, especially as they were transitioning out. And so we needed to design new systems that included the board, committees of the board, and management team. And so this is sort of a modified chart that we used as a guide to think about the difference between the board of directors, who consisted of every single member. And at the time, I think it was around 18 people, and in every position. And so that was the board of directors, whose job was to develop policy and to approve the budget, to oversee any legal matters, and at the end of that year, determine what to do with their profit. So of the board of directors, they developed committees to address employee relations, sort of more human resources issues, finance, operations. And we talked about the need for the board to direct management. And so management had policies to develop procedures with. And they're responsible for the day-to-day operations. But in the beginning, there was a lot of learning to do around decision making, that every decision did not need to include everybody, right? And so that was a big part of the transition. And some of our goals that we set from the beginning, and now I turn to quite often when I'm working with cooperatives, is that when designing these new systems, there needs to be a clear delineation of decision-making authority, clear communication channels, a clear process for any member or any governing body to submit a proposal to the board, and how to develop equitable feedback and accountability systems. So if we could move to the next slide. John and Anne, I'm wondering if you can talk some about some of the shifts that took place around decision-making, especially as we were hearing from Paola about the licensee professional judgment piece in some statutes. So things like medical policies and decision-making, where did that live? How did that change? And then other decisions that did live with you and maybe management, how that shifted, and then how that impacted culture at the cooperative.
I'll just comment about the medical part of it first. I was the first medical director for this new group, as I had been taking on most of those roles before anyways. And it just never was an issue. I mean, it was pretty clear that the doctors and technicians were the ones that drove those things. And I don't think it really hardly ever came up. And it wasn't a legal barrier for us in Wisconsin. So we didn't have to think through those things that Paola was talking about earlier. Financial, Anne dealt with so much of that stuff, so I'll let her talk more about that. A lot of stuff we're really proud of and impressed with.
Yeah, so I think we're talking right now about the initial changes, but one of the things that that has happened is our cooperative has transformed to become more and more democratically run as the years have gone by. So in 2023, we still had a pretty strong management and, as John said, medical director role. And then over the years, we've transitioned those roles to being more and more taken on by committees and board members. So financial decisions, again, as Kristin said, and as they advised us early on, you don't want to make too many changes. So, the way things are structured is probably the way that you're going to want to keep going with your day-to-day operations. You don't want to just immediately reinvent everything that's been working really well, because you want this to be a business success. So we didn't immediately turn over all of the business financial decisions to the group. But what we did turn over to them was how to distribute the profits and what that would look like in the bylaws. But the day-to-day management, financial decision-making, and the HR continued to be made by our long-term practice managers, and John and myself also with heavy involvement there. But yes, it became, I would say that although the decision-making necessarily didn't immediately shift, there was significant cultural shifts in that people now felt that they had a voice. We were actively asking the board for direction on what to do, who to hire, whether we needed more positions. So the cultural shift was very palpable, even though the day-to-day decision-making didn't change that much in year one. It is extremely different now from the way that it was then, but
the process was very two-sided. Like, we as previous owners and managers had to learn how to give up those responsibilities and powers and trust, and they had to learn how to take on those responsibilities and be accountable for their decisions. And so it was a very gradual process, sometimes very painful. But it always was a successful process in the end.
One question I have based on what you just shared is financial literacy is often one of the steepest curves, right? And it can be a fear to hand over those high level decisions to a group of employees who may or may not have had any education in finance. And so can you just talk a little bit about that learning curve? And, from the get-go, there was a finance committee, and there was a lot of learning that had to take place in order for the responsibility to truly live there. Can you talk about that?
And Anne was mostly the educator for the group. That's kind of her forte, so I'll let her answer that.
Yeah, so there were some programs that were available for financial literacy through the cooperative, the Center for Cooperatives put us in touch with some both in-person and online opportunities. And we had members taking advantage of those from the get-go. So we had several members who signed up for that coursework or attended those seminars. Specifically, our elected treasurer and our bookkeeper and some of the other people that were most interested in that started to educate themselves through these other opportunities. I did provide a lot of education. I tried to help as we would go through our monthly and quarterly board meetings, help people to understand, what's on a profit and loss statement, what key things they should be looking at. But a lot of it had to do with people really wanting to learn and to be more in charge of their own financial future. But it was a transition.
Yeah. Great. Pedro, if you could go to the next slide. And this is just an opportunity for, I'm going to let you speak on this first. And then, I certainly learned some things and have things to celebrate. But from your point of view, especially around things like, member retention and profitability and culture, conflict, what were some of the lessons learned and the successes?
So if I were to do some things differently, and it's hard to say this in retrospect because you don't know what you don't know at the time, but one thing I would have done is working on shared decision-making methods, maybe introduce them as part of staff meetings, maybe starting some committees, so the employees could start to get used to thinking of themselves as decision makers and contributors. We always had staff meetings and they were pretty open and we had relatively transparent books and things, but it wasn't nearly the extent that we went to eventually in the cooperative structure. I would really emphasize to anybody thinking about this and employees who might think they would do well in a cooperative that they really have to internalize the importance of collaboration and communication, because so much is about that transparency, working together and compromising, and not everybody likes to do that. And so some of the challenges I think we had in our first couple of years just had to do with some individuals that wasn't their thing. So I would really just kind of, I don't know if I would say warn, but encourage people to think about that. I'd also be thinking about how you could start introducing accountability practices throughout the organization at all levels. That's something we continue to work on to this day. I'd also think about more developing transparent managerial systems for hiring and firing to whatever degree possible, knowing that there's always going to be some privacy and legal limitations to some of that. Because those are things that became more and more important in the co-op. I'll let Anne talk about the successes.
Sure. So I think success, obviously, people worry about turning over the finances. The financial success has been great. The cooperative has shown continued growth over what the business looked like before. I think our first year as a cooperative, we had probably double our previous year's growth and profitability. Obviously, people were pretty excited and motivated about profit sharing. Over the years, we've taken that profit and reinvested it into our workers. So we now have an extremely generous benefits program for all of our workers, whether they are member owners or regular employees. And it's very much equalized across the groups. So you don't get extra benefits because you're a veterinarian versus an assistant. It's also kind of prorated against part-time and full-time people so that nobody is losing out on benefits because of their role or the amount of hours that they're working. Everything has been very generously redivided, and I'm extremely proud of our group for being willing to give up some of their profit to make sure that people who really needed these benefits were getting those as part of their regular compensation. And then the other financial success is sort of the personal financial success, is the patronage and the profit sharing. So in our first year, our model was largely based on the number of hours that you worked over the year was your share of the profit. So if you worked 2,000 hours against the 20,000 hours of the group, then you got 1/10 of the profit. And that didn't make any difference whether you were a kennel worker or a veterinarian. That profit was determined strictly by the hours that you worked. And the goal behind that was to recognize that every employee, regardless of their role, is critical to the overall success of the business. Of course, different roles have different base salaries, but when it came to sharing out the profit, that was a core principle. So that was a huge success. And so we had people who were all of a sudden making 20% more than they had in previous years because of this profit sharing, especially if they were people at the lower end of the wage spectrum. I think beyond the financial, we have the psychological and social. And again, I think it's the excitement, people wanting to come to work, enthusiasm for doing the job was kind of renewed, energy, and their engagement with the process across the board. So those kind of 4 E's of excitement, enthusiasm, energy, and engagement, we just saw those stepped up pretty much for everyone. Some people, as John said, didn't fit in well to the cooperative model. And we did, over the first year to 2 years, we did have people decide to leave the group, mostly voluntarily, but some people had to be asked to leave because they weren't able to really work collaboratively or cooperatively. And then the last success, which is, I think, ongoing, and I'm just really seeing it kind of exponentially change over the years as we transitioned away from managerial roles to a more democratic leadership, even in our daily operations, is it's been extremely fun for me as an ongoing employee, and I'm still a member of the board, to really see individual growth and leadership. And that has occurred across multiple practice roles. Our technicians, our nurses, our assistants, our customer service representatives, and our DVMs have all shown incredible dedication to the group, but also this growth in leadership. Right now, we're grappling with how to compensate our DVMs in the way that's most consistent with the industry standards. And I would love to spend 3 hours talking about how this group has come together to think about not only like how should individual DVMs be rewarded when they go the extra mile and drive our business, but also the contributions of people who may not be the top income drivers, but bring other things to the practice, like mental health support, and just however we decide to compensate our DVMs, to make sure that we can retain them and to make sure that they're being fairly compensated according to the industry. But how can that also reflect other roles within the practice? How do we reward an exceptional customer service representative? And so we're working through those things. But the one thing, and I think Kristin would attest to this, is that almost every decision in the end turns out to be pretty much a consensus of the whole group. So we have a lot of discussion, and when a decision is finally made, everyone feels very good about it, and everyone feels that it's maybe the best decision that we could make with the knowledge we have. And we have a tendency to try out those decisions, give them a fair try. So usually we'll try something for a year and then we'll make an adjustment. Sometimes we make a major adjustment, sometimes we tweak it. But I think that mindset of growth and leadership, personal growth, not business growth, but personal growth and leadership, and taking care of each other as well as our clients and community, that is the thing that I'm most proud of, and it is the thing I want to shout from the mountaintops.
The last thing I want to say is that for any attendees that are maybe owners of practices that are thinking about this idea, it took a good 2 to 3 years to go from the point of starting the process to the point where I retire. So now I've retired. It's running its own and works just very little and consults a little bit, but they're pretty much doing it themselves and very successfully. And I want to go back to a comment really early on in the presentation where it is such a basic thing and so simple, but why allow the profit of the work of all of these people to leave your community? Why not just keep it with everybody doing the job, rather than having it be siphoned off to corporate entities? Is just a really basic thing. You're already doing the work, you're doing everything else. Keep the money with the group in your community.
Well, I'm not going to add anything to that. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it back over to you, Pedro.
Yeah, thank you all, Kristin, John, and Anne, for a very rich conversation. And now we will quickly transition back to Kim, who will share some additional resources before we launch into one final poll and then open it up for questions and answers. Kim?
I just wanted to share some resources that there are organizations, financial organizations that are specifically set up for cooperatives and cooperative development professionals. Like Kristin was so key in this project. I wanted to call out an organization called Cooperation Works, which is actually a cooperative of cooperative developers all across the United States. And you can find by state your cooperative development center, and I have the websites for each entity. Just because we're here, I gave the websites for both the University of Wisconsin and our organization, California Center for Cooperative Development. Project Equity is another nonprofit that provides support to conversions. I forgot to put the ICA group, but they certainly do this as well. Anne and John have graciously offered, hey, contact us. So they are also available. Some of the financial institutions that fund these kinds of businesses that are specifically dedicated to cooperatives and know about cooperatives, there are certainly lots of funding organizations. These are the ones that we've found are the most knowledgeable and so forth. Most of these are CDFIs. They're nonprofit organizations that provide financial loans. Usually, well, I don't know if the rates, sometimes the rates are less. They can access a lower rate. They charge interest. But Shared Capital Cooperative, National Capital Impact Partners, Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, also known as LEAF, and then the National Cooperative Bank is another source. So these will be available to you. Everyone that attended today will give you a handout of all of the slides, so you'll be able to have this information.
Okay, so we have a question from Christine. Christine says, I'm assuming membership is only held by members of the clinic. What happens to those retiring? Do they have shares?
We
Go
can
ahead,
talk
John.
about what our business did, but one thing I just would say generally is you guys get to decide when you become a co-op how you want to do this. It is super flexible. And the way we decided is once you are no longer an employee, you get your membership buy-in amount back. There's some other reserve account stuff that I don't quite understand. And maybe could talk to that.
Yeah, I think Kristin may be a good one to answer this question. I think it's generally held that employee ownership is for employees, and once you are no longer an employee, you would pretty much universally, get your share purchased back from the clinic. The clinic would purchase it back for you. You would get your initial contribution returned. Is that correct, Kristin?
Yeah, that is correct. Although there are conversions that where as so long as a retiring or owner still has money in the cooperative, so if there is seller financing, there are arrangements made for that retiring owner who may not be working anymore to retain a place on the board of directors, for instance. So there are mechanisms that can be used to ensure that the retiring owner still has some decision-making power, so long as they still have a significant amount of money in the cooperative. But generally speaking, yes, membership is for employees, and that is the primary criteria for membership.
I have a question for the panelists. You mentioned that it was challenging for some of the members to participate and work cooperatively. What do you think, from a developer's perspective, Kristin, is key to getting people to understand the value of ownership and embrace those responsibilities?
Good question. I mean, I think that as a developer, the way that we talk about ownership is really important. Ownership doesn't only come with the privileges of and the power in decision making. That this isn't conventional ownership. Like if I owned my own business, I could do with it what I chose, right, on my own, and reap the benefits or consequences. But collective ownership is different, and I do think that piece around sort of an individual ownership mindset versus a collective ownership mindset is important to discuss from the very beginning. I also would say that even though, we went through a process of democratic decision making. There was a pretty significant commitment by that steering committee on the early side, and they learned and they practiced democratic decision making. And I would say, as a developer, that I would always use that process from the beginning, that before the conversion takes place, that employees are included in this process of governance design and drafting governance documents. I think the other thing, though, is getting, in retrospect, I think having a really clear, as much as you can, description of what membership responsibilities truly are, and including those in governing documents so that members can be held accountable for that, that this is beyond your responsibilities as an employee, and being able to outline those and hold, and consider those a responsibility of membership is important. And another thing that I think that the clinics did, and it just, it's kind of the way, I think part of this is unavoidable, right? Like membership and ownership is attractive for many reasons, but we come into these new ways of working with a lot of conditioning. We understand work and work environments in the ways we've been conditioned since children in schools, and so it's it's an ongoing practice. And so setting up the sort of culture and practice from the beginning, but also conflict, talking about conflict, addressing conflict, not shying away from power dynamics that don't go away after you're a cooperative, right? Like there are still those dynamics, and we need to talk about them at like, not that they are bad, that they are just normal, and they do create conflict. And so how do we engage in conflict productively, without shame? And the clinics did that. I mean, they did bring somebody in to address sort of existing conflict that was there. Anyway, so I think that those are my initial thoughts. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions, or if John and Anne, you have anything to add.
I'm seeing a question in the chat that I'll try to be super brief because we're coming low on time, but it's talking about accountability. And I think you just hit on that, Kristin, which was that, the culture shift of I'm not going to just go to management now with my problem with person X. I am going to have a conversation with person X, and we're going to figure out how this relationship is going to bring the team up or bring the team down. So that's part of the accountability. And it's about kind of growing into this role of personal accountability. So I would say that that's something that, we did a lot of work on in the way of accountability. Like, you're not necessarily going to be told how to do everything. You have to now think through the process, think about the consequences. Your behaviors are now, you're accountable to the whole team, and they're going to hold you accountable. It's not just the manager. So you can't now come to your coworker and say, the manager is making me do this. Your responsibility to your coworker is much more front and center.
And I think to address the person's question about, well, what are some specific examples of accountability? One thing that eventually got developed was a grievance committee. So if you have a problem, you can't work it out with that individual, you would come to this committee. Then they had specific delineated processes for moving the process along, which ultimately, if could not be resolved, the decision would be made by the entire board on how to resolve the conflict. So to me, that's like the ultimate accountability is you go to the board and the board decides, whether your grievance is justifiable and how they want to handle it as a group.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you, John and Anne, for addressing Juliet's question in the chat. And we'll make that the last question for the sake of time. And with that, we'll conclude today's webinar. I just want to thank our panelists for sharing your time, expertise, and experiences. And thank you for everyone who joined us today and participated throughout the discussion. Just a reminder that the webinar was recorded. We'll be sending the recording out and any related resources to the participants in the coming days. If you have any questions or like to learn more about the cooperative ownership, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again for being with us today.